She has been called the Queen of British cinema, a goddess of the stage, and one of the boldest women Hollywood has ever seen. Yet behind the red carpets, the Oscars, and the dazzling performances lies a story very few dare to tell. At 80 years old, Helen Mirren stands as a living legend, but her journey is far from a fairy tale. It is a story of rebellion and resilience, of battles fought in silence, and of a tragedy that time itself has written into her life. This is not just the story of an actress. This is the heartbreaking truth of Helen Mirren. Helen Lydia Mironov was born in London in 1945, just months after World War II had ended. Her father, a Russian immigrant, had changed the family name to Mirren in hopes of fitting in, while her mother came from a working-class English family. Growing up in Southend-on-Sea, Helen was far from the glamorous world of stardom. She was quiet, thoughtful, and, as she would later admit, painfully self-conscious. But on stage, something transformed. At the age of 13, she performed in a school production of Hamlet and was instantly captivated. Theater became her escape, a world where she wasn't just the shy girl from Essex, but a force commanding the spotlight. Yet when Helen won a place with the prestigious National Youth Theatre and later joined the Royal Shakespeare Company, she quickly gained a label that would both define and haunt her early career: the outsider. Unlike many of her peers, she wasn't from privilege. She hadn't studied at Oxford or Cambridge. She was blunt, sensual, and unapologetically herself. And in a world dominated by rigid tradition, that made her both magnetic and controversial.
I'd like you to explain what you mean by my equipment in
Well, people watching...
great detail.
Well, your physical attributes.
You mean my fingers?
No, I meant your...
Come on, spit it out.
I meant your figure.
Her role as Cleopatra at just 20 years old stunned audiences. She wasn't the polished, restrained actress the establishment expected. She was raw, fiery, unashamed of her sexuality. And while some critics praised her brilliance, others dismissed her as nothing more than the sex queen of Stratford. That label would shadow her for years to come. Helen Lydia Mironov entered the world on July 26, 1945, in a Britain still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Her arrival came just weeks after the Allies declared victory in Europe. London's skies were finally clear of bombers, but the scars of war were everywhere. Food rationing was still in place. Buildings lay in ruins and families were grappling with loss. For Helen's parents, Vasily Mironov and Kathleen Rogers, her birth was both a personal joy and a new responsibility in a fragile, uncertain world. Helen's family story was one of contrasts: old-world Russian aristocracy clashing with working-class English grit. Her father, Vasily Basil Mironov, had been born into Russian nobility. His own father, Pyotr Vasilyev. By the time Helen was born, Basil was determined to blend into British society. He even anglicized the family name from Mironov to Mirren, a change that would later both shield Helen from prejudice and spark her sense of being an outsider. Her mother, Kathleen Rogers, was a working-class Londoner of English heritage. She came from a family of butchers and laborers, deeply practical, grounded, and toughened by war. The marriage of Basil and Kathleen united two vastly different worlds: aristocratic Russian bloodlines and no-nonsense English resilience. That duality, nobility in name but working-class reality, would leave Helen with a complex identity from the very beginning. Helen grew up in Ilford, Essex, just outside London. Ilford was not glamorous. It was suburban, grey, and deeply ordinary. Her childhood was defined by post-war austerity, strict rationing, make-do clothing, and the kind of everyday resilience that British families wore like armor. Despite the grey environment, Helen's imagination thrived. She loved fairy tales, Shakespeare stories simplified for children, and the magic of performance. She often entertained her siblings with dramatic retellings of books she read, sometimes exaggerating characters so wildly that even her parents laughed. Her father, Basil, was not amused by this artistic streak. A pragmatic man, he wanted Helen to pursue a sensible career, something stable, reliable, and respectable. Acting to him was a frivolous dream, not a life path. This tension would define Helen's early years, a constant tug-of-war between practical expectations and artistic yearning. Even as a child, Helen felt different from the other kids. Her unusual surname, Mirrenoff, set her apart. In post-war Britain, anything foreign, especially anything Russian, carried suspicion. The Cold War was dawning and children could be cruel. Classmates teased her for her strange name, her odd background. Her family's aristocratic Russian roots, stripped though they were, created an invisible barrier. She wasn't fully English in the eyes of her peers, nor was she Russian enough to belong to her ancestral world. Helen later recalled that this sense of not fitting in, this outsider label, never really left her. It gave her both insecurity and strength. On the one hand, she felt like she never quite belonged. On the other, it gave her a perspective that would fuel her acting. The ability to step into different roles, to reinvent herself, to inhabit worlds she didn't belong to. Helen attended St. Bernard's High School for Girls in Southend-on-Sea. One of her teachers noticed Helen's natural flair for storytelling and encouraged her to audition for school plays. At first, Helen was shy. Her outsider identity made her hesitant to step forward. But once she took the stage, she discovered something profound, a place where difference wasn't a weakness, but a strength. Playing characters gave her power. On stage, she wasn't the awkward Russian English girl with the funny name. She could be anyone, a queen, a servant, a goddess, a hero. Despite her growing love for drama, Helen's father was unrelenting. He wanted her to train as a teacher, a secure profession for women at the time. Basil, still carrying the wounds of displacement from Russia, feared instability more than anything. He knew the fragility of status and wealth. He wanted his daughter safe, not chasing uncertain dreams. Helen, ever torn between duty and passion, did initially follow his wishes. After finishing school, she enrolled at a teacher training college in London. But her heart wasn't in it. Every lecture, every lesson plan felt like a distraction from the real fire burning inside her. The turning point came when Helen auditioned for the National Youth Theatre, NYT, at age 18. The NYT was a launching pad for many British actors, and Helen's audition was electric. She performed Cleopatra from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, a bold choice considering her age. But Helen poured all her intensity, all her outsider longing into that performance. She was accepted. This moment changed everything. For the first time, Helen felt she had found her tribe. Among other young actors, misfits, and dreamers, she wasn't an outsider anymore. She was exactly where she belonged. But even as she stepped into the world of theater, Helen couldn't escape the outsider label. Her surname, Mirrenoff, still carried foreignness. So like her father before her, she anglicized it to Mirren. This decision wasn't just cosmetic, it was survival. In 1960s Britain, foreign names were often barriers to casting. Helen knew that if she wanted to succeed, she needed to appear more British. Yet deep down, she carried that Russian heritage with pride. It made her unique, even if the world didn't fully accept it. By the time Helen was 20, the outsider label had transformed from a burden into a weapon. She had learned how to channel feelings of alienation into her performances. Every role she played carried the intensity of someone who understood what it felt like to be on the margins. Her outsider perspective allowed her to see characters not as archetypes, but as complex humans, misunderstood, layered, contradictory. This became her artistic signature. The young girl teased for her name had become the young woman who could stand on stage and captivate audiences by embodying the very strangeness she once tried to hide. For Helen Mirren, the ascent to fame was never the problem. She had that in spades. The looks, the raw talent, the Shakespearean pedigree that made critics whisper that she might be the next great British actress. Yet what no one could prepare her for was the suffocating box that Hollywood and even Britain's theater establishment seemed determined to keep her in. The world loved to watch Helen, yes, but on their terms, as a body first and an artist second. And this constant tug of war between her craft and her image eventually drove her to a breaking point. By the late 1970s, Mirren was everywhere, but she was also deeply unsatisfied. Casting directors were quick to label her as the sex queen of British cinema. Journalists, often with a smirk, referred to her as the thinking man's sex symbol. It sounded flattering on the surface, but for Mirren, it was a prison. Every interview seemed to revolve around her body, not her performances. Even on national television, male hosts would grill her about her figure, her looks, or how it felt to be so attractive. She endured condescension, innuendo, and constant objectification, all while trying to talk about Shakespeare, Chekhov, or the nuances of acting. This was the first crack in the armor. She was respected but not taken seriously, admired but not always for the right reasons. And the more she resisted, the more the industry pushed back. If she accepted glamorous, risque roles, she was accused of being too provocative. If she turned them down, she was wasting her beauty. It was a lose-lose situation. Behind the camera, the emotional toll mounted. Friends would recall how Helen seemed split in two, the confident, witty actress in public, and the introspective, often frustrated woman in private. She worried she would never be free of the sex bomb label. In her own words, she hated being reduced to the naughty girl stereotype because she knew she had much more to offer. Yet, time and again, the offers that came across her table reinforced that image. By the early 1980s, this inner conflict reached its peak. Helen was approaching 40, an age where Hollywood often discards actresses, especially those who built careers on desirability. For most, it's the point where scripts dry up. The pressure was immense. Every decision felt like a gamble. Should she accept another role that traded on her sensuality, or refuse and risk fading into obscurity? For Helen, who had spent her entire life chasing authenticity, the thought of being remembered only as an object of desire was unbearable. The true breaking point wasn't one explosive moment, but a slow accumulation of humiliations, frustrations, and missed opportunities. Interviews where she was mocked, roles she felt trapped in. Even her celebrated performances came with caveats. Critics would praise her intensity. It was exhausting. Mirren later admitted that she struggled deeply with self-doubt during this period. She felt typecast, cornered, and misunderstood. Worse, she was aware that her talent wasn't being used to its fullest potential. She could perform Shakespeare with the weight of Judi Dench or Vanessa Redgrave, but while those contemporaries were seen as serious actresses, Helen was still battling to shake off tabloid labels. The disparity cut deep. This was Helen Mirren's crisis point, a career that was thriving on paper but hollow in her heart. And it was here, in the crucible of frustration and disillusionment, that the seeds of reinvention were planted. The shift began quietly. Instead of succumbing to the pressure, Mirren made a radical choice. She would stop caring about the labels and take control of her own narrative. Reinvention, for her, meant leaning into what made her unique rather than apologizing for it. She realized that sexuality and intellect did not have to be enemies. Why should she let critics define sensuality as the opposite of seriousness? Why should she conform to an industry that told her she could only be one or the other? This defiance was the start of her reinvention. She began to accept roles not for how they might be received by the press, but for how they challenged her as an actress. She embraced complex, morally ambiguous characters. Women who were sexual, yes, but also intelligent, layered, and flawed. Characters with agency, power, and contradictions. In doing so, Mirren reclaimed control over her image. The turning point came with her work in television, particularly in Britain. In the 1990s, she took on the role of Detective Chief Inspector Jane Tennyson in Prime Suspect. This was the breakthrough that shattered the glass ceiling. Tennyson wasn't glamorous or designed for the male gaze. She was gritty, tough, and burdened by the sexism of her profession. Yet she was also vulnerable, flawed, and human. For the first time, audiences and critics alike began to see Helen not just as a beautiful actress, but as one of the greatest performers of her generation. What made Prime Suspect revolutionary wasn't just the writing. It was Helen's unflinching portrayal of a woman navigating a male-dominated world. The role mirrored her own battles with Hollywood's patriarchal machine, and perhaps that's why she played Tennyson with such raw authenticity. The character became a cultural icon, and Helen earned international acclaim, multiple BAFTAs, and, most importantly, a new level of respect. But reinvention wasn't only professional, it was personal. Helen began to embrace her individuality off-screen as well. She refused to conform to Hollywood's expectations of women her age. While many actresses were pressured into cosmetic enhancements or playing only maternal figures, Mirren leaned into her age with pride. She embraced her natural look, spoke candidly about aging, and even later, famously posed for magazines well into her 70s, proving that beauty and sensuality don't have an expiration date. This defiance turned into inspiration for countless women around the world. She became a symbol of liberation, proof that women could define themselves on their own terms, not the industry's. By reclaiming her sexuality as part of her identity, rather than something to be ashamed of, Helen dismantled decades of typecasting. Her reinvention also carried her to the global stage. Roles in Gosford Park, 2001, The Queen, 2006, and countless others solidified her reputation as one of the finest actresses alive. When she finally won the Academy Award for portraying Queen Elizabeth II, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was the ultimate act of vindication. The sex symbol had become a monarch, not only on screen but in the hierarchy of world cinema. Looking back, Helen often describes this arc, from frustration to freedom, as her greatest triumph. The breaking point had threatened to crush her, but instead, it forced her to redefine herself. In a way, her struggle mirrored the journey of women everywhere, fighting to be seen beyond appearances, to be valued for substance over surface. And perhaps this is why Helen Mirren resonates so deeply. She didn't just reinvent her career, she reinvented the definition of what it means to be a woman in Hollywood. No longer either the beauty or the brain, but both. No longer confined to youth, but radiant in every stage of life. Her story, then, is not just one of survival, but of revolution, because Helen Mirren did not let her breaking point define her. She turned it into the foundation of her reinvention, and in doing so, she gave permission for generations of women to follow. When the 1980s dawned, Helen Mirren stood at a professional crossroads. She had conquered Shakespeare, stunned critics in daring stage productions, and carved out a reputation as a fiercely independent actress who refused to be typecast. But in cinema, her name was still tethered to the label of art house performer. The mainstream film industry wasn't sure what to do with her. Was she a Shakespearean goddess too refined for mass audiences, or a sensual firebrand best confined to provocative European dramas? That tension would define her career in the early 1980s, and ultimately, it would become the crucible in which Helen Mirren transformed herself into an international star.
In 1981, director John Boorman cast Helen in Excalibur, an operatic retelling of the Arthurian legend. As Morgana Le Fay, the sorceress who manipulates and seduces her way through Camelot, Mirren unleashed all the qualities that had long unsettled traditional casting directors: raw sensuality, regal poise, and a subtle menace that could shift into tragic vulnerability in an instant. For Mirren, Excalibur was more than just a role. It was her declaration that she could carry myth on her shoulders. The film, drenched in medieval pageantry and surreal visuals, became a cult hit, and Morgana cemented itself as one of her most iconic performances. Her on-screen presence was magnetic, seductive but never shallow, powerful but never cartoonish. This role marked a crucial turning point. Suddenly, international audiences were whispering her name. She was no longer just a stage darling or the star of niche British cinema. She was a cinematic force, capable of embodying characters larger than life. 3 years later, Mirren took on a very different kind of role, one rooted in political reality rather than fantasy. In Cal, 1984, a small but deeply moving Irish drama set during the Troubles, she played Marcella, a Catholic widow who falls in love with a young man tied to the IRA. The performance was haunting, tender, restrained, and devastatingly human. The film itself may not have been a global blockbuster, but it cemented Mirren's reputation as one of the most fearless actresses of her generation. For her work, she won the Best Actress award at Cannes, one of the most prestigious honors in world cinema. That award carried weight. It told Hollywood and Europe alike. Helen Mirren wasn't just a Shakespeare actress. She was a global talent capable of piercing emotional truth, whether in myth, melodrama, or gritty realism. If Cal showed her humanity, Peter Greenaway's The Cook, The Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, 1989, pushed her back into controversy. In this surreal, provocative, and disturbing art film, she played Georgina, the abused wife of a violent gangster who begins a torrid affair under the shadow of grotesque cruelty and violence. The movie was shocking, blending operatic visuals with explicit sexuality and brutality. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as a masterpiece of political allegory. Others dismissed it as grotesque excess. But one thing was clear: Helen Mirren was unforgettable. Her performance was visceral, courageous, and unapologetic. At a time when many actresses were pigeonholed into safe, conventional roles, Mirren continued to defy categorization. She refused to be boxed in as the classy Shakespearean or the sex symbol. She was both and more, complex, layered, and fearless. Perhaps no role did more to solidify her fame than Jane Tennyson, the hard-nosed detective at the center of Prime Suspect. When the series debuted in 1991, TV was still dominated by male detectives, with women relegated to side roles. Mirren shattered that mold. As Detective Chief Inspector Tennyson, she was brilliant, uncompromising, and deeply human, battling criminals, sexism, and her own flaws. Audiences were hooked, critics raved, and the role earned her BAFTAs, Emmys, and something bigger: household name recognition. Jane Tennyson wasn't glamorous. She drank, she aged, she struggled, and in showing that raw humanity, Mirren reached new heights of relatability and stardom. Her cinema career soon surged. In The Madness of King George, 1994, she played Queen Charlotte with a quiet strength that earned her a BAFTA and her first Oscar nod. By Gosford Park, 2001,
Her subtle turn as Mrs. Wilson stole the show from a star-studded ensemble, winning her more awards and cementing her as a fixture of prestige cinema. Then came the crowning moment, The Queen, 2006. Playing Elizabeth II in the aftermath of Diana's death, Mirren delivered a performance that was more than impersonation. It was a portrait of duty, grief, and conflict. The triumph won her the Oscar, BAFTA, Golden Globe, and SAG Award, placing her among the greatest of her generation. By the late 2000s, Mirren had gone from the rebellious sex queen of British stage to a global cultural icon, proof that risk-taking, authenticity, and reinvention could outlast Hollywood's narrow rules. But Hollywood has never been kind to women as they age. The industry thrives on youth, often sidelining older actresses into one-dimensional roles. Mirren spoke openly about this double standard. While men were called distinguished, women were too often dismissed as past their prime. Scripts once rich with passion became shallow and offers fewer. Helen resisted. She refused to chase youth artificially, choosing instead roles that reflected her truth. Though the lack of opportunities was painful, she leaned into reinvention, independent films, stage work, and advocacy. She became a critic of Hollywood's obsession with beauty and age, using her voice to demand richer roles for women. Her resilience turned her into more than a star. She became a symbol. For younger actresses like Meryl Streep and Viola Davis, Mirren's outspokenness on ageism laid the groundwork for ongoing conversations about equality in film. For audiences worldwide, she embodied authenticity and strength through vulnerability. Helen Mirren's legacy is not only in her Oscars or BAFTAs, but in the countless women she inspired to embrace age, reinvention, and truth. She showed that even
Helen's story is one of triumph and heartbreak,
a journey that reveals both the cruelty of Hollywood and the unstoppable strength of a woman who refused to be forgotten. She may have faced the shadows of ageism, but in doing so, she illuminated a path for others to follow. Her career wasn't just about stardom. It was about resilience, reinvention, and the courage to remain true to oneself in an industry that often demands masks. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. Until next time, this is Vintage Spotlight, where the secrets of classic Hollywood come alive.
That was today's story under the silent spotlight.
If you enjoyed uncovering Hollywood's forgotten past, leave a like and subscribe for more vintage tragedies, mysteries, and untold legends. Until next time, keep the reel turning.